I've been on a journey. Nay, not a journey. A quest. A quest worthy of taking the ring to Mordor. And this quest has been to find the most perfect Super Nintendo controller, even if said Super Nintendo controller isn't a Super Nintendo controller. I've tried things like the PS5 controller, which actually wasn't that bad. It's probably one of the best. I've also tried this. Where is it? It's right here. Spoiler alert. This is awful. Just don't do it. If you ever think you're gonna try this, just don't. Just put it away. It's a bad idea. Not worth it. What have I also done? I tried the Super Famicom controller. And this is just the Super Nintendo one, but basically it was released in Japan, which is roughly the same thing, but it's just, I have yet to find a perfect controller that fits my needs, which I'm also, like, I'm picky. I'm an elitist, so will I ever find a controller that I like? I don't know, but there's a controller by RetroSix that I've had my eye on. This is the RetroSix Super Gamepad, and it was made specifically for the Super Nintendo. Some of my favorite things about this, the fact that, one, there's actually LED lights on it, but let's actually turn on the LED lights real quick. So, pressing the bumper buttons, X and A at the same time, and then up on the D-pad right there, and that turns on the lights. And if these aren't bright enough for you, let me show you something that's possibly brighter than my future, maybe your future, that's the future of the world. That's a really, really bright controller. As I said, you can also turn it down if you do the same button combination and then just down on the D-pad. And one of the other things you probably noticed I was doing, I was unplugging the controller. This is a braided Type-C cable that actually came with it. At least it came with all three of these. So I have three of these now. But at the other end is a Super Nintendo controller input for a Super Nintendo, so don't try, like, getting a Type-C one like this, that has Type-C on the other end, plug it into your computer, because it doesn't work, or at least it didn't work from the amount of effort that I put into it. I'm not gonna act like I put super effort into it, but Windows, like, Device Manager didn't seem to show anything. All it did was just, like, power up the LEDs, so yeah. Some of my favorite things were those. Now let's talk about how the buttons are and how they feel when you're pressing down on them. Specifically, the buttons can feel squishy. And I don't know, at first I was like, I don't think it matters too much, but the more I started to use the controller, and I was like, yeah, I don't really think that I like it. The way the D-pad's sort of set up is it seems like the rubber may be a little bit higher than normal. So the amount of pressure that is required to actually press down on it is a little bit more, even though the rubber is sort of squishy. And it's just, it still takes a little bit more effort to press down. I found myself actually missing some inputs just because of that. What is sort of silly is, one thing to know, the gamepad itself is technically modeled like after a Super Famicom / Super Nintendo controller, and if you take it apart, it looks exactly like that. It's pretty much, it's an easier version of taking that apart, really, and you can still use the same rubbers and everything that would actually come from a normal Super Nintendo controller. I actually replaced the rubbers from a Super Nintendo controller. This was the one that was originally in there, and I put it in here, and I like it a little bit more. That way, it's entirely possible I could have gotten used to something like this. But it's sort of cool to know that I can customize it to the point that I can still take some parts from another controller and put it into here. Now, that's not for everyone, and I think a controller that you purchase should just sort of, like, work right out of the bat. But I'll acknowledge that, like, I am probably a little harder to please than the average individual when it comes to a controller, because, well, I'm a little bit of an elitist. One thing that's always annoyed me about Super Nintendo controllers has always been the D-pad. If you press left or right on it, sometimes there'd be a chance that it would also register an up or a down input. And that is not what you want, especially if you're doing any kind of Super Mario World Kaizo. If you've ever done shell jumps and stuff like that, sometimes you need the shells going upwards, but you don't want the controller to choose for you when the shell's going to be thrown upwards, because it's really depressing to make it to the very end of a really hard level, and the controller's like, see the shell right here? It would be a shame if it got thrown upwards. Okay, so now we're gonna test out the D-pad inputs with the Super Mario World speedrunning ROM. If you look up at the top right, it actually has button inputs. So we're gonna be able to know if the D-pad is throwing an upwards input in or not. We're gonna press right. Now I have a feeling if I barely hold up on this while still holding right, it's gonna do the input. So yeah, I am still only holding right, but there's still a chance that it throws in an upwards input, and it more than likely will still do that on the left. Let's see, yeah. Still doing it on the left. We'll try some other controllers here. Left. If I lightly hold up, it does it. And it'll probably do the same thing going right. Lightly hold up, and it does it. Now for the last controller. Lightly hold up. Yeah, it's doing it, and we lightly hold up while going left. This controller doesn't seem to do it as bad. Sadly, I wish it would be the opposite direction, because that would have been really nice. But these are problems I feel like D-pads have always had these problems. I don't know if there's really any way to completely alleviate it. I can say that I've found controllers that it didn't happen as frequently with. And I feel RetroSix are on the right direction. I have a hard time believing that the D-pads are always going to be that way. Without further ado, I'm going to show you some pictures, and then I'm going to show you some gameplay with my thoughts on the controllers while I'm using them. Okay, so let's see. Sadly, one of the first things that I'm noticing is I'm barely pressing down, and for some reason, it'll, like, skip over one. It, like, presses it twice. Let's see if it's gonna do that on all these controllers. Okay, so it did it again on this one. And it's doing it on this one, too. That's already not starting off very good. So this level is going to be a really good way to test the D-pad. Like I said previously, it's really easy to accidentally throw a shell upwards. So let's see if we can get it to do that. So far, so good, though. So far, so good. Right there, you'd have to throw it upwards. That's actually a really precise little movement to do right there. So that's a good sign for this D-pad. Alright, now for the blue Koopa. Oh, man. Okay, so a triple shell jump right here. Oh god. Oh god! There we go. So we did it! So this level is going to be more for testing out buttons that are not the D-pad. Well, obviously you have to use the D-pad. We're more just testing out the jumps and everything like that. Right here, that's sort of a D-pad test. But cool. So we may not make it. No, we got it. We got it. We good. Dude, this level's terrifying. And I love it. Okay, right here. Got it. Easy every time. Whew. Oh, yeah. Yeah. That end part, that requires very, very precise, like, amounts of pressure and knowing when to press the button. So I'm glad that we got that. So this level is going to be a really good way to test the D-pad because of the ropes. If you press up or down on there, you're going to be grabbing onto it. And then the jumps right here, very, very specific. If you apply too much pressure, Mario's going to go too high. Wait a second, that may not make it, we'll see. Oh, we got it. Here, wait a second. If you want my overall opinion on this controller, it's pretty decent. On a scale of like 0 to 10, I'd give it a 7. And I think this would probably be a pretty easy 8 or a 9 if just the rubber and the controller was a little bit better. To be fair, this is the first revision of the controller, and when I first reached out to RetroSix, they said specifically that the rubber that they used was something that people had sort of mentioned they thought maybe they could do a little bit better on. So I'm assuming the next controllers that come out with better rubbers should be anywhere from an 8 to a 9. Maybe it's even a perfect controller. I don't know. But my favorite thing, LED. Also, man, you can't beat the fact that you can literally unplug the controller. This is so cool, because if you think maybe you have, like, a short in the controller or something like that, and you want to keep the controller itself, heck, just reach out to RetroSix. Maybe they'll send you a different cable. Maybe you need to buy a different cable. And that ends up being pretty important too, because if you don't want to break in another controller, it's so nice. You can literally just keep this one and just wait for another cable to come in. There you go, folks. So that's my opinion on the Super Nintendo controller by RetroSix. I think that they're on the right direction, and hopefully this controller will only get better with time. Tell me what you thought about the controller. Did you like the LEDs? Do you have this controller? Maybe you've used it before. Am I crazy for saying that it's a little bit too squishy? I'd love to know down in the comments below. Also, don't forget to hit that subscribe button.